I want to tell you about the morning I went back for my military ID because if I hadn't, I might be someone's wife right now instead of someone's cautionary tale. 3 weeks before my wedding, I stood frozen behind my own back door listening to the man I loved describe in a calm and pleasant voice exactly how he planned to take everything I owned. He didn't know I was standing there. He didn't know what I did for a living. And he had no idea that the woman he was about to marry had spent 12 years learning how to spot a liar for a living. My name is Heather Morgan. I'm 35 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and for the better part of my career I've worked in a division. Most people never hear about internal investigations, fraud detection, the quiet rooms where we untangle the financial crimes that happen inside a uniform. I've spent years reading spreadsheets the way other people read novels, hunting for the small inconsistency that tells you someone is stealing. I've testified against officers who thought they were smarter than the system. I've learned that the most dangerous people rarely look dangerous. They look charming. They look trustworthy. They look exactly like the man I was engaged to. Daniel Carter was 38, a financial advisor with an easy laugh, and the kind of manners that made older women at parties clutch his arm and tell me how lucky I was. He opened doors. He remembered birthdays. He asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers. When I introduced him to my friends, more than one of them pulled me aside afterward and said some version of the same thing. You found a good one, Heather. Hold on to him. I never told him the truth about my work. It wasn't a lie exactly. It was a habit built over years of handling sensitive cases that I couldn't discuss with anyone outside a secure room. Daniel knew I was an officer. He knew I worked long hours and traveled sometimes without explanation. He believed because I let him believe it that I handled administrative logistics, paperwork, personnel schedules, nothing interesting. I told myself I was protecting the integrity of my cases. Looking back, some part of me may have also been protecting something else, though I wouldn't understand that until later. 8 months into our engagement, everything about our life together felt settled in the way that good things settle quietly without drama. We'd picked a venue. We'd sent invitations. My mother had already cried twice looking at swatches of blue fabric for the bridesmaids' dresses. Daniel handled most of the wedding logistics himself, which I'd found endearing at the time. He said he wanted to make things easy for me since my job kept me busy. He said he loved taking care of things. That morning started like any other. I left the house a little after 7 dressed in plain clothes since I had a personal errand before reporting to base. Dropping off dry cleaning, picking up coffee, the small, unremarkable tasks that fill the edges of a life. I was maybe 10 minutes down the road, stopped at a light when I reached for my bag, and realized my military ID wasn't in it. I'd left it on the kitchen counter right next to my keys, in the spot where I always left it and somehow hadn't grabbed that morning. I turned the car around without a second thought. It was an ordinary inconvenience, the kind that happens a dozen times a year and means nothing. I remember feeling mildly annoyed with myself, nothing more. I had no sense pulling back into our driveway that I was about to learn something that would unravel everything I thought I understood about the next 50 years of my life. I let myself in through the side gate instead of the front door out of habit. More than anything, it was closer to where I'd parked. As I came around toward the back porch, I heard Daniel's voice. He was on the phone, pacing near the railing with his back to me, and something about his tone stopped me before I'd even registered why. It wasn't his warm voice, the one he used with me. It was clipped, businesslike. A voice I didn't recognize. I almost called out to him right then. My hand was actually lifting to wave when I caught the sentence that made me go still. Once the marriage license is signed, everything else falls into place on schedule. I don't know how to explain what happened in my body in that moment. It wasn't panic, not yet. It was something colder. The same stillness I get when I'm reading a financial statement, and a single number doesn't match the story around it. Instinct took over before understanding did. I stepped back against the wall of the house out of his sight line, and I listened. He kept talking, his voice low, and measured the tone of a man laying out a plan he'd rehearsed before. He said that after the wedding he'd bring up some paperwork, something about consolidating our finances, making things simpler to manage as a married couple. He made it sound reasonable, even generous. But I know what a general power of attorney sounds like when someone is trying to make it sound like a formality. I've read hundreds of documents exactly like the one he was describing, and none of them were formalities. Then he laughed, quiet and pleased with himself, and said that I had more assets than I even realized, and that I clearly had no idea how to protect them. My chest tightened. I stood there in my own backyard in my own life, listening to my fiancé talk about my future as though it were a project he'd already completed on paper. The worst part came a few seconds later, delivered so casually it almost didn't register at first. If she figures it out, it'll already be too late anyway. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Somewhere behind my ribs, 12 years of training clicked into place, and before I'd even decided to do it, I had my phone out and the voice recorder running, capturing every word through the thin morning air. I want to be honest with you, I didn't confront him. Not that day, not for a long time after. Standing there, I understood something with total clarity. I no longer knew who the man on that porch was, and I was about to find out exactly how far he was willing to go. I didn't say a word to him that morning. I walked back to my car the same way I'd come, quiet, unhurried, my face arranged into nothing at all. Inside, something had already shifted permanently, but I've spent my career learning how to keep my expression still, while my mind runs at full speed. And that morning, that training became the only thing standing between me and a decision I might have regretted. I drove to base like I did every day. I sat at my desk, answered emails, sat through a briefing I couldn't tell you a single detail about afterward. Around noon, I finally closed my office door, put in my earbuds, and listened to the recording again. Then again. By the third time, I wasn't hearing my fiancé anymore. I was hearing a subject. That's the word we use for someone under investigation, and somewhere in that sterile little word I found the distance I needed to function. What struck me most wasn't the plan itself, though. That was bad enough. It was the ease of it. The rhythm of his voice had the cadence of something rehearsed, something worn smooth by repetition, the way people sound when they've said the same reassuring lie to a client many times before. In my line of work, you learn that amateurs sound nervous, professionals sound bored. Daniel had sounded bored. I called Marcus that afternoon. He'd been my training partner years ago when I first moved into investigations, and he'd since transferred to a unit that specialized in background verification, legal above-board work, the kind that shows up in due diligence reports, rather than courtrooms. I told him I needed a favor personal, and he didn't ask many questions, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. I gave him Daniel's full name, date of birth, and the city where he grew up, and I asked him to run what he could through public records and licensing databases. Nothing classified, nothing that would raise flags, just the truth, whatever it turned out to be. He called me back 2 days later, and I remember exactly where I was standing when my phone rang, because I never sat down for that conversation. I stood in my kitchen with my back against the counter, staring at nothing while Marcus read off what he'd found in a flat, careful voice, like he already suspected I wasn't going to like it. Daniel had been engaged twice before me. Both times the engagements had ended within a year of the wedding date, one canceled outright, one that apparently went through and dissolved in an annulment within 8 months. Both women had, according to property records Marcus could access, transferred significant assets into joint accounts or trusts naming Daniel as co-owner or trustee shortly before those relationships ended. Both women had, as far as public records showed, walked away with a fraction of what they'd brought into the relationship, and neither of them had filed a single complaint, a single lawsuit, a single police report. I asked Marcus if that seemed strange to him too. He said something I haven't forgotten. He said in his experience, people who've been embarrassed rarely want an audience for their embarrassment. They sign what's put in front of them and they disappear, and they tell themselves it was a lesson learned rather than a crime committed against them. Most of them never even use the word victim. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I thought about the way Daniel talked about his past relationships, always with a gentle, almost wounded tone, always framing himself as the one who'd been hurt, who'd trusted too easily, who'd learned to be careful. I thought about how good that story had sounded to me, how completely I'd believed it, how many times I'd found myself wanting to protect him from women I'd never met and never would. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. This wasn't paranoia. I know the difference between suspicion and evidence, and I built this understanding the same way I'd build a case file at work, slowly, methodically refusing to let myself draw conclusions faster than the facts could support them. But by that second night, lying awake next to a man who had no idea what I now knew, I understood that I wasn't dealing with a single lie. I was looking at a pattern. And patterns, in my experience, don't happen by accident. I began doing something I'm not proud of, though I don't regret it either. I started paying closer attention to Daniel in a way I never had before, not as his fiancé, but as an investigator watching a subject. I noticed things I'd overlooked or explained away, the way he always steered conversations toward my finances under the guise of wedding budgeting, the way he'd casually mention how nice it would be to combine our accounts for simplicity. The way he'd bring up estate planning with a kind of gentle urgency, as though it were something responsible adults simply did rather than something that would hand him control over everything I'd built in 12 years of service. I thought about calling off the wedding right then. I sat with my phone in my hand more than once, his name pulled up on the screen, ready to end it with a single sentence. But something held me back, and it wasn't sentiment. It was the two women before me, the ones who'd signed and disappeared and never said a word. If I walked away quietly now, Daniel would simply recover, recalibrate, and find someone else. He would do this again. I had spent my career going after people who thought they could take what wasn't theirs and vanish before anyone noticed. I wasn't going to let this be the one case I walked away from. So instead of confronting him, I did the only thing that made sense to someone trained the way I was trained. I decided to build a case, quietly, carefully. And I decided that Daniel Carter was going to find out in the worst possible way exactly who he thought he was marrying. For the next several weeks, I became someone I'd never had to be before, an actress in my own life. I smiled at the right moments. I laughed at his jokes. I let him hold my hand across restaurant tables and tell me in that warm voice he saved just for me how excited he was to finally make things official. Every night I went home and played the part of a woman deeply in love. And every night I lay awake afterward, running through what I'd learned, feeling the strange exhaustion that comes from performing devotion you no longer fully feel. Daniel, meanwhile, grew bolder. It started small, a suggestion here, a passing comment there, but within 2 weeks the requests had a clear shape to them, and once I saw the shape I couldn't unsee it. He wanted to merge our bank accounts before the wedding, so everything's already streamlined when we get back from the honeymoon. He wanted to add himself as the primary beneficiary on my life insurance policy, framing it as just standard practice for married couples. He brought up putting his name on the deed to my house, the house I'd bought myself with my own money 3 years before I ever met him, describing it as a gesture of trust between partners. And then, almost gently, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned a document his associate could draw up, something called a durable power of attorney, just in case anything ever happened to either of us, so the other person could handle things without a legal headache. I agreed to all of it on the surface. I told him it sounded reasonable. I told him I trusted him completely. I watched something settle in his face each time I said, yes, not joy exactly, but satisfaction, the particular look of a man watching a plan proceed on schedule. Behind the scenes, I was doing something very different. I found an attorney 2 towns over, someone with no connection to Daniel or our social circle, a woman named Patricia Reyes, who specialized in estate and financial law. I told her everything, the recording Marcus's findings, the documents Daniel was asking me to sign. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she said something I still think about. She said that what I was describing wasn't unusual in its individual pieces. Couples merge accounts. Couples update beneficiaries. What made it different was the sequencing and the pressure, and the fact that every single document benefited one person substantially more than the other. She walked me through what would actually happen if I signed everything Daniel was asking for. The power of attorney alone would have given him legal authority to manage, transfer, or liquidate nearly every asset I owned without needing my signature on individual transactions. Combined with joint accounts and a shared deed, I would have handed him in practice, if not in explicit language, control over almost everything I had built in 12 years of service and saving. Patricia didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. She simply laid the documents side by side and let me see the shape of the trap for myself. It was around this time that I learned something else, something that made my stomach turn in a way the earlier discoveries hadn't quite managed to do. I'd met Daniel's mother, Carol, only a handful of times, always brief, always pleasant. She was polished and warm in the same practiced way her son was, and I'd never thought much of it beyond assuming that's simply where he'd learned his manners. But when I mentioned to Patricia, almost in passing, that Carol had been the one to recommend the financial associate who'd suggested some of these documents, Patricia went quiet again and then asked me to get her the associate's name. It took her firm less than a week to find what she was looking for. The associate wasn't licensed to give the kind of financial advice he'd been giving. He had no verifiable credentials at all. In fact, no registration, no oversight, nothing beyond a business card and a confident manner. And Carol, it turned out, had a documented history of being present in one capacity or another around both of Daniel's previous engagements. She wasn't simply his mother offering warm support to a son in love. She was, as far as the pattern suggested, a participant. I remember sitting in my car outside Patricia's office after that conversation, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process the idea that I wasn't dealing with one manipulative man, but with a family that had built something close to a system. A rehearsed script, a trusted associate, a supportive mother smoothing the edges. I thought about the two women before me again, and for the first time, I let myself really imagine what those final months must have looked like for them. The same warmth, the same gentle pressure, the same slow narrowing of options until, signing away, everything felt not like a loss, but like a reasonable, even loving decision. I didn't cry that day, though I came close. What I felt instead was something harder and more useful. 12 years in this line of work had taught me that anger without a plan is just noise. So I sat there until the feeling passed, and then I called Patricia back and asked her exactly one question. What would it take to protect everything I owned so completely that none of this would matter, no matter what I signed in the weeks ahead? She told me it could be done. It would take time, discretion, and precision. I told her I had all three. By the time I drove home that evening, I had made a decision that would define everything that followed. Daniel could keep planning his wedding. I would be planning something else entirely, and he wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late to stop. I requested 4 days of personal leave the following week, telling Daniel I needed to help my mother with something back in Ohio. It was the first outright lie I told him, and I remember how easily it came, how naturally my voice stayed level as I said it. That unsettled me more than I expected. I'd spent my whole career catching people who lied smoothly, and now I understood in a way I never had before exactly how smooth it could feel from the other side. I didn't go to Ohio. I stayed local, working with Patricia and a private investigator she trusted named Ray Delgado, a former detective who'd spent 15 years on financial crimes before going independent. I was careful about how I approached all of it. This wasn't a military investigation, and I never once used my position, my clearance, or any Army resource to pursue it. Every step went through civilian channels, Patricia's firm, Ray's license, public records, and legal financial disclosures. I wanted this done right, not just effectively. If Daniel was going to be exposed, it needed to hold up outside of anything I could personally influence. Ray started with the basics: surveillance, financial footprints, patterns of movement. Within 2 days, he found something I hadn't anticipated. Daniel was meeting regularly with a woman named Jessica Hale, always at the same coffee shop downtown, always with folders and a laptop between them. At first, watching the photos Ray sent over, I felt something twist low in my stomach, the obvious assumption rising before I could stop it. But Ray was careful to tell me not to jump ahead of the evidence, and when he finally got close enough to overhear part of one conversation, the picture became both less personal and far worse. Jessica wasn't a girlfriend. She was a business partner, and the business, as it turned out, was people like me. Ray's notes described the two of them reviewing what looked like financial documents, statements, property records, something that resembled the same kind of file Patricia had built for me, except this one was about my life assembled by the two people I trusted least. They discussed timelines. They discussed the wedding date. At one point, Jessica's voice came through clearly enough for Ray to catch her asking whether the house would be listed right after, and Daniel confirming that it would once ownership had transferred the way they'd planned. The house. My house. The one I'd bought with a down payment I'd saved for 3 years while stationed overseas, eating the same base cafeteria food for months, so I could put every spare dollar away. Hearing that they'd already discussed selling it so casually as though it were simply the next item on a checklist, did something to me that the earlier discoveries hadn't. I'd been able to stay analytical about the accounts, the power of attorney, even his mother's involvement. This felt different. This felt like watching someone plan the demolition of something I'd built with my own hands without me in the room. Ray's deeper financial work uncovered the piece that finally made the entire picture click into place. Daniel wasn't simply greedy or opportunistic. He was drowning. Through a combination of public court filings, lien records, and a source Ray had cultivated at a local title company, we learned that Daniel had lost more than $800,000 in a series of failed real estate investments over the previous 2 years. He owed money to at least 3 different private lenders, one of whom had already filed a judgment against him that he'd managed to keep quiet by settling just enough to avoid it becoming public knowledge through normal channels. His financial advisory business, the one that had impressed me so much when we met, was barely functioning. Most of his income over the past year had come from somewhere else entirely, and Ray strongly suspected that somewhere else was women exactly like me. I sat with Patricia and Ray in her office on the 3rd night of my supposed trip to Ohio, looking at a timeline they'd built across a whiteboard: dates, dollar amounts, names. 2 previous fiancés. A pattern of asset transfers, a mother with a documented role, an unlicensed financial associate, a business partner conducting what amounted to due diligence on a future victim, $800,000 in debt that would vanish the moment he had access to what I owned. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a structure built carefully over years, refined with each attempt, and I happened to be standing in the spot where it was about to close. I asked Patricia somewhat numbly what would have happened to me if I hadn't gone back for my ID that morning. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, she said that based on everything they'd found, I likely would have signed the power of attorney within the first few months of marriage, framed as routine urged along by both Daniel and his mother. Within a year, possibly less control over my assets would have shifted almost entirely to him. And by the time I noticed, if I noticed at all unwinding, it would have required exactly the kind of expensive, humiliating legal fight that Ray said both previous women had clearly decided wasn't worth having. I drove back into town that night instead of waiting for my leave to officially end. I didn't go home. I sat in a diner parking lot for almost an hour, engine off, watching people come and go through the window. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, none of them aware of how close I'd come to losing everything to a man who still at that very moment believed he had me completely fooled. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the loud way I'd been a week earlier. What I felt was quieter and far more dangerous to Daniel, though he had no way of knowing that yet. I felt ready. I came home from my trip to Ohio and told Daniel it had been exhausting, that my mother's hip surgery recovery had taken more out of both of us than expected. He hugged me at the door, told me I looked tired, made me tea, and asked if there was anything he could do to make the next 3 weeks easier on me. I let him fuss over me for a few minutes, and I remember thinking with a strange clinical detachment that he was genuinely good at this. Not good as in kind, good as in skilled. It was, in its own way, useful information. I needed to know exactly what I was up against. The wedding preparations moved forward without interruption. Invitations had already gone out weeks earlier, so there was no reasonable way to pause things, even if I'd wanted to, and I didn't want to. Patricia and I had discussed this at length. Calling off the wedding early would only give Daniel time to regroup, to disappear, to try this again with someone else in another city, under another version of his story. If I wanted this to actually end not just for me, but for whoever might have come after me, I needed him to walk all the way to the altar believing he'd won. So I played my part. I picked out flowers with my mother, who kept asking with the particular radar mothers have whether everything was really all right. I told her yes, everything was fine, and hated myself a little for the lie, though I promised myself I'd explain everything to her the moment it was over. I tried on my dress for the final fitting and stood in front of the mirror while the seamstress pinned the waist, watching my own face in the reflection and thinking about how strange it was to look so calm on the outside while planning in careful legal detail the dismantling of the man standing at the center of all this. Daniel grew more relaxed as the wedding approached, not less, which told me everything about how confident he'd become. He started dropping little comments about our future together with a new ease, the kind of comfort that comes when someone believes the hardest part is already behind them. 2 weeks before the ceremony, he brought home the final version of the paperwork, the power of attorney. The account consolidation forms an updated beneficiary designation on my life insurance policy. He'd had his associate draw it all up, so we wouldn't have to deal with it during the honeymoon. He slid the folder across the kitchen table like a man presenting a gift. I read through it slowly, the way I imagine he expected me to, nodding at the appropriate places, asking a question or two about wording that made me seem thoughtful rather than suspicious. Then I signed it. All of it. Every page. What Daniel didn't know, and what he had no reason to suspect, was that Patricia and I had spent the previous week preparing exactly for this moment. The documents in that folder were never going to touch anything real. Weeks earlier, quietly and with airtight legal precision, Patricia had helped me move the substantial majority of my actual assets into an irrevocable trust. My savings, my investment accounts, and eventually through a separate and fully legal transaction, the equity in my house. The trust had its own trustee, its own protections, and its own terms that made it essentially untouchable by anyone outside a very narrow set of circumstances, none of which included a fraudulent power of attorney signed by a woman who already knew exactly what was being attempted. The papers Daniel had proudly presented me with were in practice close to meaningless. They granted him authority over accounts that, by the time I signed, held only a fraction of what he believed was there. The house deed transfer he'd requested applied to a property whose real value had already been restructured through the trust. He held a folder full of signatures that looked on paper like total victory. In reality, he held almost nothing. I want to be honest about how strange that moment felt, watching him take the signed documents back with such quiet satisfaction, thanking me for making this so easy, kissing my forehead like he was closing a business deal rather than promising his life to someone. Some small, tired part of me still ached even then. I'd loved this man, or at least the version of him he'd shown me for 8 months. Grieving that version, even while dismantling the real one, turned out to be more complicated than I expected. I didn't let it slow me down, but I let myself feel it briefly alone in the bathroom that night with the water running so no one would hear anything. The final days moved quickly after that. My mother arrived in town 3 days early, fussing over centerpieces and seating charts, completely unaware of the storm gathering underneath the surface of what she assumed was simply wedding week nerves on my part. My best friend from officer training, Nadia, flew in and immediately sensed something was off, cornering me in the kitchen one evening and asking point blank if I was having second thoughts. I told her the truth. In a way, I told her that I had never been more certain of anything in my life. She took it as reassurance about the marriage. I let her. Patricia and Ray stayed close throughout that final week, coordinating quietly, making sure every document, every recording, every piece of evidence was organized and ready. Patricia would be at the wedding, seated toward the back, dressed like any other guest, carrying nothing that would suggest she was about to become the most important person in the room besides Daniel and me. We had gone over the plan more times than I could count. There would be no scene at the reception. No dramatic confrontation in a parking lot after the fact. If this was going to happen, it was going to happen exactly where Daniel had planned to claim his victory at the altar, in front of everyone who had ever believed in the man he'd built himself to look like. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror in my dress, my mother fastening the last button at the back. Tears already in her eyes for reasons that had nothing to do with what I knew, and everything to do with what she still believed. I looked at my own reflection and felt something settle into place, calm and certain, the same feeling I used to get right before walking into a room to deliver findings that would end someone's career. I was ready. Daniel had no idea what was waiting for him. The chapel was full by the time I stood behind the doors, my father's arm steady beneath my hand, the string quartet playing something soft and familiar that I couldn't have named if my life depended on it. Through the small gap in the doorway, I could see the room, white flowers lining the aisle, Daniel's family filling the left side, mine, filling the right, nearly 200 people who had traveled in some cases across the country to watch two people promise their lives to each other. I could see Daniel at the front adjusting his cufflinks, glancing toward the door every few seconds with an expression of pure, uncomplicated happiness. I remember thinking that he looked genuinely excited, and that this, more than anything else I'd learned about him, told me exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. He wasn't nervous. Men who are about to commit themselves honestly are nervous. He was simply pleased. The doors opened, and I walked down the aisle exactly the way I'd rehearsed it in my mind for weeks, poised, composed, smiling at the right faces, my hand steady on my father's arm. I reached the front. Daniel took my hand, his fingers warm and certain around mine, and for one brief, unwelcome moment, some old part of me ached at how easy this still felt, how convincingly his face could still perform love. Then I let that moment pass, and I became once again exactly who I needed to be. The officiant began the ceremony. I listened to the opening words with a strange, distant calm, the same feeling I used to get in the seconds before delivering a verdict I already knew the outcome of. We moved through the early portions of the service, and when the officiant reached the point where he asked if anyone present had reason, the two of us should not be joined in marriage, I felt the entire room hold its breath out of pure ceremonial habit, the way it always does at weddings. Nobody actually expecting an answer. I spoke instead. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I asked if I could say a few words before we continued, and I watched confusion flicker across Daniel's face, quickly smoothed over into something patient and indulgent, as though he assumed I simply wanted a personal moment before we exchanged vows. I turned slightly toward the guests, found Patricia's calm, steady face near the back of the room, and reached into the small clutch I'd been carrying, pulling out my phone. I told the room in a clear and even voice that 3 weeks earlier I had gone back home to grab something I'd forgotten, and that what I overheard that morning changed everything I thought I understood about the man standing beside me. I pressed play. Daniel's own voice filled the chapel, cutting cleanly through the silence, describing his plan to secure my signature on documents that would hand him control of everything I owned. I watched his face as his own words reached the back rows, watched the color drain from him. In real time, watched 200 people go from confused to horrified within the space of about 15 seconds. He reached for my arm, said my name, started to say something about how I was misunderstanding out of context. But his own recorded voice was still playing, and the line about it already being too late if I figured it out landed into a silence so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. When the recording ended, Patricia rose from her seat and walked calmly to the front of the room the way she'd practiced, carrying a folder that looked almost identical to the one Daniel had presented me with weeks earlier, except everything inside it was real. She introduced herself simply as my attorney and asked for the room's patience for just a few minutes. She laid it out clearly without theatrics the way good lawyers do. She explained that Daniel Carter had concealed more than $800,000 in personal debt from his fiancé, that he had, along with an associate operating without proper licensing, attempted to secure a power of attorney and beneficiary changes that would have transferred substantial control of my assets to him following the marriage. That public records showed a pattern stretching back through 2 previous engagements, both ending with similar transfers of assets and no formal complaints filed, and that as of that morning, none of it mattered, because every document Daniel believed he'd secured applied to assets that had already been legally and irrevocably protected weeks in advance. I watched Daniel's mother Carol go pale near the front row, her hand rising slightly to her mouth. I watched her husband turn to look at her with an expression I didn't have time to interpret, before she stood, gathered her purse, and walked quickly out the side door without a word to anyone, including her son. Daniel tried again to speak, his voice cracking now, insisting this was all some kind of misunderstanding, that he could explain everything if I would just give him a chance. Nobody in that room was interested in giving him a chance. I watched guest by guest people I'd known my whole life, and people I'd never met, begin to rise from their seats. Not in a chaotic rush, not in a scene from a movie, but quietly, deliberately, 1 row at a time, filing toward the doors with the particular silence of people who had just watched something true happen in a room built for promises. My father stood beside me the entire time, his hand steady on my shoulder, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. My mother stood frozen for a long moment before crossing the front of the chapel and simply putting her arms around me, and I let myself lean into her for exactly as long as I needed to, no longer performing anything for anyone. Daniel stood alone near the altar as the last of the guests filed out, his cufflinks still perfectly straight, his carefully rehearsed charm completely useless against a room that had just heard in his own voice exactly who he really was. I looked at him one last time, and I felt none of the things I might have expected: no rage, no satisfaction, nothing dramatic at all. I felt only the quiet, settled relief of someone who had done thorough work and watched it hold exactly as intended. Then I turned and I walked out of that chapel on my father's arm, still in my wedding dress, toward whatever came next. The wedding that never happened became in its own strange way the most talked about event in our small circle for months afterward, though not for any reason Daniel would have wanted. Within days, the story had traveled well beyond the 200 people who'd been sitting in those pews. I didn't share it publicly myself. I didn't need to. Patricia had, with my full cooperation, already forwarded our complete file, the recording, the financial records, the pattern of prior engagements, Ray's investigative findings to both a civil attorney representing my interests and the appropriate licensing board overseeing financial advisors in our state. Daniel's professional license was suspended within 6 weeks pending a formal review that, from what I later heard, found more than enough grounds to revoke it permanently. The firm he'd worked for quietly let him go before the suspension even became public, unwilling to have their name anywhere near what was starting to surface. His unlicensed associate, the one who'd drafted the fraudulent paperwork, faced his own separate legal troubles once state regulators started asking questions about who he'd been advising and under what authority. What surprised me most in the weeks that followed wasn't Daniel's unraveling. I'd expected that, planned for it in some sense, already grieved it before it happened. What surprised me was what came after Patricia's office, at my request, reached out through legal channels to the 2 women whose names Marcus had first uncovered months earlier. I hadn't known what to expect. Silence, maybe. Embarrassment. Instead, both women eventually chose to come forward. First, quietly through their own attorneys, And then, once they understood, they weren't alone with a directness that told me how long they'd been waiting for someone to believe them. Neither had ever filed a police report at the time, exactly as Ray predicted, but with documentation now connecting 3 separate cases, civil suits became possible in a way they hadn't been before. I don't know how those cases will ultimately resolve. I know that Daniel is now facing them without the calm, unshakable confidence he once wore so easily. And I know that the women who once disappeared quietly are no longer disappearing. As for me, I went back to work. There was no parade, no announcement, nothing to mark the fact that I'd walked away from a wedding still wearing the dress. I filed my leave paperwork, returned to my desk, and picked up exactly where I'd left off because that's what 12 years of discipline teaches you to do. My colleagues who knew pieces of the story were kind about it, in the understated way soldiers tend to be kind to each other. A hand on the shoulder, a quiet, "You good?" in passing. Nothing that required me to relive it out loud more than necessary. I didn't feel triumphant, not in the way people sometimes assume I must have. I've thought about that a lot since. What I felt mostly was a deep and steady gratitude, the kind that settles into your chest rather than announcing itself. Gratitude that I'd forgotten my ID that particular morning. Gratitude for 12 years of training that taught me to listen before reacting, to gather evidence, before making accusations, to trust a pattern over a feeling. Gratitude for Patricia and Ray, and Marcus, and every person who helped me build something solid enough to stand on while the ground underneath me was quietly being pulled away. I think about the 2 women who came before me sometimes, the ones who signed and walked away and told themselves it was simply a lesson learned. I understand now in a way I couldn't have before this happened to me exactly how someone ends up there. It isn't stupidity, it isn't weakness. It's love offered honestly to someone who has learned precisely how to exploit it. I was fortunate enough to have the tools, the training, and the timing to see it before it was too late. Not everyone does. That's part of why when people ask me if I regret how public parts of this eventually became, I tell them no. If sharing what happened to me keeps even one other person from signing away their life to someone who rehearsed the words in advance, then walking down that aisle and speaking up in front of everyone I knew was worth every uncomfortable second. In the military, they train you to recognize threats from an enemy you can see coming, someone in uniform, someone on the other side of a clearly drawn line. Nobody trains you for the version that shows up holding flowers, remembering your coffee order, telling you that you're the best thing that's ever happened to him. That was the hardest lesson of my career, and I didn't learn it in any classroom or briefing room. I learned it in my own backyard on an ordinary morning, because I happened to turn my car around for a piece of plastic with my photo on it. I don't know exactly where my life goes from here. I know I'm not in a hurry to trust easily again, and I know that's all right. I know I still believe in love, real love, the kind that doesn't come with hidden paperwork or rehearsed timelines. And I know that whatever comes next for me, I'll be walking into it with my eyes open exactly the way I should have been from the start. If you've made it this far with me, I want to thank you for sitting with this story. It wasn't an easy one to live, and it wasn't always an easy one to tell. I'd love to know what stayed with you most, and where in the world you're watching from tonight. Leave a comment below and let me know. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, so if this reached you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep walking through these stories together.